The knowledge of how to make the simplest objects in our world does not exist inside human heads. It exists between and among human heads.
Ideas themselves as being reproductive.
Ideas having sex is the phrase that I may be remembered for. The other problem with money that we've got today is the intrusion of government into owning the money.
Reality itself is perhaps language-like.
And it shows that trade may be a lot older than language.
I made my decision to not get the jab purely on the heuristic that if the product is free, then you are the product.
India went from famine to overabundance in a few years, almost entirely because of that one gene. It's the most extraordinary story. And by the way, I think Borlaug probably saved more lives than any other human being on the planet.
Wow, amazing.
I mean, my book is not about human beings. At one point I say, look, boring brown African apes are not nearly as interesting as beautiful blue birds.
But Dawkins, share that one. That's so funny that you guys that are into evolutionary biology seem least interested in
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're just yet another mammal, really.
Matt Ridley, you were the first Zoom interview I've done in quite some time, actually. We've been doing all these recordings in person, but I could not say no to an opportunity to talk to you. You've been a prolific author. I was just telling you offline that I first was introduced to your work through your book, The Rational Optimist, which is an excellent piece of work. I'm homeschooling my nephew right now, and he's worked his way up to that book, and I found myself excited to jump back into it, to actually go through it with him. So it's really good. I learned a lot from it. The way you write too, I don't exactly know how to put words to it, but you have this, well, at least in that book, I guess it has some excitement and optimism woven into it. So
Yeah.
it's fantastic. I recommend it highly to everyone, and just really excited to be able to talk to you today.
Thank you very much, Robert. It's an honor to be on your show, and interesting to revisit The Rational Optimist, because it was 15 years ago that book came out, and I've been writing more since on the similar topics, and in some ways a little of my optimism has been dented, but not all.
Yeah, you've definitely changed the arc of what you're writing about in the past 15 years. I'll name a couple of your books and feel free to plug whatever I'm missing here. You've also written a book called The Evolution of Everything, which we'll talk about a little bit today. Most recently, you've written Birds, Sex, and Beauty.
Yep.
Maybe I'll let you kind of plug those and mention what those books are about as well.
Yeah. So the evolution of, in some ways, I think of Rational Optimist, Evolution of Everything, and How Innovation Works, which were three books I wrote in 6 years, as it were, as a trilogy, as three books about innovation from different angles. Rational Optimist is about the extraordinary fact that human beings have dramatically improved their living standards over decades, centuries, and even millennia, and have done so at an accelerating rate, and have done so through innovation, and how is this, and how far could it go, and why are we so pessimistic about it? Then The Evolution of Everything is sort of the argument that actually language, culture, technology evolve in a very real sense. They change through trial and error in a bottom-up way, in just the same way that biological evolution happens. And then How Innovation Works was literally my attempt to sort of take on, what is this strange phenomenon called innovation, and why does it happen to us and not to rabbits or rocks? What are the sort of rules about making it work? Why does it work in some places and sometimes better than others? So that I used that book to tell a lot of stories about innovation. And then, as you say, my last two books, since then, I've gone back to my biological roots rather more, and I wrote a book about COVID. I co-wrote it with Alina Chan of MIT. It's called Viral, and it's about the search for the origin of that virus, which turned out to be a very, very interesting story. And finally, the book that came out just this week, it's called Birds, Sex, and Beauty. And it really is kind of back to my roots because I was an evolutionary biologist studying birds about 40 years ago. And I've always enjoyed birds, and I particularly like their flamboyant plumage and their colors and their songs and all that kind of thing, all of which require explanation. And the explanation is sexual selection, Darwin's theory of mate choice, which has some very interesting and I think underappreciated implications. I call it the fun version of evolution.
Very good. Yeah, super interesting span of things you've written about. And I think it's natural for us just to begin where I was introduced to you originally, which was the Rational Optimist. I often refer to the first chapter you wrote in that book where you describe the computer mouse. I think you even have a picture of the computer mouse, something like this, actually.
Mm-hmm.
The thumb ball computer mouse, which I use here at my desk. And you make this somewhat seemingly audacious claim that no one knows how to make this thing, right? That it's actually it's the distributed intelligence of societal cognition, the division of labor. I'm not sure how we want to frame this, that actually the supply chains and people interacting through money, which is obviously germane to this show, are what enable us to create a sophisticated piece of technology like this. But there's no single individual in the world that could sit down and just create the computer mouse from scratch.
Yeah, and in doing that, I was shamelessly borrowing an idea, which is, of course, partly the argument I make that we all borrow ideas. I was shamelessly borrowing an idea from, I've suddenly forgotten his name. He's called Reed, and forgotten his first name. But anyway, a guy called Reed in the 1950s wrote an essay called I Pencil.
Oh, yes. Fantastic essay.
It's a wonderful essay because I think it tells you more about how the world works than almost anything I've read in such a short space of time, short space of paper, as it were. And the pencil investigates his own existence, discovers that an awful lot of people contribute to the making of a pencil because there's somebody chopping down a tree to make the wood, there's somebody mining graphite to make the lead, there's somebody working in the pencil factory, there's somebody marketing the pencil, somebody retailing the pencil, but upstream there's a person brewing coffee for the man who goes to cut down the tree, etc. And when you think this through, you realize that there are millions of people involved in making the simplest object. And with the computer mouse, I make the point that there's plastic and metal and silicon in this thing, and there's ideas that came together from different people in different times and different places, people who never met each other, combined collectively into how to make this computer mouse. But what is so extraordinary is that not one of them knows how to make a mouse or a pencil or anything else. The knowledge of how to make the simplest objects in our world does not exist inside human heads. It exists between and among human heads. Yeah. And that, for me, is an tremendously important insight because it gets straight to the point that commerce, I don't like using the word capitalism, but some people do, is an immensely collaborative, cooperative business. It really does, through the division of labor, each of us doing a more and more specialized thing when we produce something so that we can be more and more diversified when we consume things, is the great story of the modern world and the reason why living standards have been able to rise. We've got, you make podcasts, I make books, nothing else. I'm useless at absolutely everything else. I certainly couldn't make my shelter, my clothing, my food, etc. So we've moved away from subsistence, from self-sufficiency, towards tremendously specialized output, but tremendously diversified input consumption. And that, for me, is the big theme of human prosperity, human living standards, human society, and human economic activity.
Yeah, again, to shout out that essay, it's poetry almost on the division of labor. It's a fantastic essay. I always encourage everyone to read that. I actually like it so much that we're going to be doing a little thing for it on the show. I'm just going to do a read of iPencil and then we'll put some animation over it at some point. But it's
Fantastic.
truly good.
That's great. Well, actually, somebody who read one of my books sent me an image of a pencil that explodes into thousands and thousands of strands at the top. It's a beautiful image. I'll send it to you if you like.
Yeah. Oh, please. Oh, so it shows all the individual commodities that go into the pencil, perhaps through the explosion.
Well, no, it just threads, but it gives you this a sort of visualization of the same thing. I
Yeah.
mean, I can find it if you like.
Yeah,
It won't
sure.
take
That'd be
long.
wonderful. We'll put that in the episode, actually. Um, as you're
Yeah.
doing that, maybe I could try to form this next thought slash question. So it really, this is a theme I think that's been visited by a lot of thinkers and authors. Obviously, Adam Smith, going back to The Wealth of Nations, talked about the division of labor, possibly even coined the term the division of labor. I'm not sure if he was the first one to do that. Um, the book Sapiens, talked about the human capability of cooperating flexibly in large numbers, kind of being our, oh yeah, that's great.
Can you see that?
Yeah, that's a great
It's a lovely image.
cover image for the essay.
Yeah. Um,
For the audio,
yeah. Sorry, I
looks like
interrupted.
no, it looks like I mean strands of spaghetti sort of coming together into the pencil, and that's
Yeah.
the visual of
And I couldn't remember his name. He's called Leonard Reed, of course. So
great,
I
yeah.
give him
I was
credit.
just saying that this theme's been visited by a lot of thinkers and authors. I mentioned Adam Smith coining the division of labor. Um, Yuval Harari. I'm not particularly fond of him overall, his involvement with World Economic Forum and whatnot, but his book *Sapiens* I did read, and I thought when he described the human capability of being able to cooperate flexibly in large numbers through the use of symbol, that's kind of the human superpower.
Mhm.
And so the question or thought I wanted to pose to you here is like in this process, this when we are connected in economies and we're able to subdivide these phases or portions of the labor what is this, portions of the production process into such fine things, as you said, you write books and I make podcasts, right? We're basically useless for everything else.
Sorry, I didn't mean
We've
to imply
progressed
you.
so far, though, that we can be so hyper focused on one little niche activity, and we have this trust that everyone else will sort of just do the same thing. And then in that trust, we all get to enjoy the hyper specialized fruits of one another's labor.
Exactly.
That's what gives rise to, the luxury of modern living, basically. In addition to all the innovation and progressing living standards, et cetera. So what I wanted to ask about is like the role of money in this process. That, money is this, it's often called the language of human action or the language of value. It's almost like if this is, I always think about it through the metaphor of one collective hive mind, right? The price signal is coordinating all of this human action at scale that serves everyone. And money, I guess the metaphor I'd like to invoke is something like a neurotransmitter. Money's acting like kind of like a neurotransmitter for this global economic hive mind. And I
Hmm.
just wonder if you had thoughts about the role of money in this distributed cognitive process we call the global economy.
Yeah, I confess to being still a little confused about money. I did write about it at length in Rational Optimist. I've spent a lot of time thinking about money, and I'm not a monetary theorist or anything like that. The history of money is intriguing as well, but there's something about that subject that has never quite clicked for me.
Hmm.
It's partly the confusion as to whether it's a store of value or a medium of exchange. It's clearly both, but which comes first, which matters most, etc., is quite confused, I think. And then there's the whole question of the tokenistic nature of money. How can a piece of paper or even a bar of gold be valuable in itself? So for me, the best way to think about it is to go right back to first principles and say, what we are doing as human beings, almost uniquely in the animal world, by the way, is dividing our labor. I'll do what I do, you do what you do. We'll then both bring the fruits of our labor to the party and share them, and we're both better off because we're both focused and specialized and efficient at the bit we do. I'll catch the fish, you build the house. We're both better off. Yet clearly, if we had to barter fish for houses or fruit for entertainment or whatever it is every time, it would be way too complicated to arrange. What's the exchange rate for each of these devices, these different outputs? So we invented money as being the sort of middleman in all these exchanges. We'll value my fish in money and we'll value your house in money, and then we know exactly what the exchange rate is for everything. And that feels to me like the best way of thinking about money, which, as you can see, drives me towards the feeling that the medium of exchange is the really important feature of money, more so than the store of value. And for me, the development of Bitcoin and the conversations that went on before the invention of Bitcoin were really intriguing because they were wrestling with this issue. And in a sense, Bitcoin is the ultimate experiment in whether or not we can develop a much more perfect currency. Because the other problem with money that we've got today is the intrusion of government into, as it were, owning the money, deciding whether to print the money, and what the interest rate should be and all that kind of thing. So fiat currencies and the role of central banks seems to me to be a topic where real problems have been injected into human affairs, problems of inflation, problems of debt, and so on, which may outweigh the advantages of having the government in charge. Now, I'm quite influenced here by the writings of George Selgin, who is a monetary economist and a very good one. And in particular, he wrote a very interesting essay about the Scottish financial system in the 1700s when Adam Smith was in Edinburgh and Glasgow.
Free banking, right.
Yeah, and it's a free banking period because the official Scottish bank had backed a rebellion in 1715. The government said, "Well, right, we're going to charter a rival bank," and then there were other rival banks, and there were 5 or 6 banks that were able to issue currency in Scotland, and they developed mutual trust among themselves because they wanted their paper to be convertible by each other. And therefore, they were able to ostracize any bank that behaved less cautiously. And actually, it produced an extraordinarily good monetary system, which was destroyed almost overnight when, in the 1800s, the British government in London said, "Oh, this is no good. We can't have this," and said, "No, from now on, you have the pound issued by the Bank of England. And by the way, here's inflation, and here's all sorts of other problems that come with it." So there's part of me that is a real libertarian idealist about money who thinks that out there is a perfect bottom-up solution controlled by nobody, let alone central government, for how we operate the medium of exchange among people. But I admit that I'm not clever enough to know how we get there.
That's fantastic. you use the word invented, and I do think language, describing money as language is probably the best way to describe it because it does seem to emerge naturally anywhere there are people interacting, as does language. And so therefore it is emergent, right? But there is this, so it's bottom up, but there are these top-down pressures like the state or government that attempt to commandeer that emergent phenomenon for its own institutional advantage. And it's not too unlike, I think, aspiring dictators or demagogues trying to manipulate the media, right?
Yep,
Actually,
exactly.
that's what money's often described as well, right? The universal medium of exchange. So it's
Yeah.
the communication systems that need to be co-opted to engage in social engineering. And I think natural language and money seem to be the two most important
Yeah.
ones.
Yeah.
Um,
Um, just to tell a little story that I think is useful here, and I completely agree with you about it being an emergent phenomenon, not an invented phenomenon. Um, I came many years ago. I came across an article called "Stingray Barbs for Stone Axes" or something like that, and it was about the exchange rate between stingray barbs and stone axes among different Aboriginal tribes in northern Australia in the 19th century. And what this person had worked out is that there was a stone axe quarry hundreds of miles inland, and there were people living on the coast who caught stingrays and used the barbs off these stingrays as spear points. And that if you traveled from one to the other, you find a changing exchange rate. So that, at the coast, stingray barbs are cheap and stone axes are expensive. And by the time you get inland, it's the other way around. And I just thought this was a wonderful example of a monetary system, if you like, that had emerged in a foraging society before Western contact, and that was nonetheless very sophisticated, and showed you kind of where money had come from. Now, I was then very intrigued by a paper I read about pierced shells of a particular species that were found inland in Algeria, northern Africa, dating from about 100,000 years ago. And these had been used as sort of jewelry or something like that. But the point is, they'd traveled hundreds of miles inland 100,000 years ago. Now, almost certainly they didn't do so by somebody picking up shells on the beach and walking hundreds of miles inland. Almost certainly he traded them with his neighbor, who traded them with his neighbor, who traded with them with his neighbor. So they ended up a long way inland. We find that pattern all over the archaeological record, but we never find it from 100,000 years ago in any other case. That really is a long time ago. And it shows that trade may be a lot older than language, possibly.
wow.
Certainly older than farming or anything like that. And it reminds me of a wonderful remark that Adam Smith made when he said that, talking about the human propensity for truck, barter, and exchange, he said, "No man ever saw a dog make fair and deliberate exchange of a bone with another dog." And what he meant was this habit of swapping, sharing. I've got some of these. Would you like them? You've got some of those. I'd like them. Is deeply rooted in human beings, goes a long way back, very instinctive, and absolutely vital to the process of exchange, but also the process of inventing money.
That is fascinating. I've never heard that particular example you just shared, but I've long thought that it's very likely trade predates language. It
Yes.
just sort of intuitively makes sense to me, right?
Have you ever wanted to live in an off-grid community with complete food, energy, and water independence? If so, then you need to check out the farm at Okefenokee. The farm is a pioneering community designed to foster longevity and well-being, eliminating elements that detract from these goals. At the farm, the convergence of nature, nutritious food, a supportive community, and the ethos of slowing down is unparalleled. Positioned at the gateway to the UNESCO World Heritage nominated Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge, the farm at Okefenokee stands as a testament to a lifestyle that truly nurtures health and happiness. Unlike conventional housing developments where a token communal garden may suffice, the farm itself is the community. Small, intimate microvillages seamlessly integrate into the fabric of a sprawling agricultural community. So if you're interested in joining this off-grid community, then go to okefarm.com today to learn more about becoming a member. Make sure to tell them that I sent you for a $21,000 discount on their custom cabin pricing. Again, go to okefarm.com to learn more about joining this revolutionary regenerative agriculture community. iCoin Technology has released a slick new hardware wallet. It looks like a mini iPhone with a high-res 3-inch touchscreen and camera on it. The device has no Wi-Fi, no cellular connection, and no GPS. It is an air-gapped hardware wallet which uses QR codes and a camera to communicate with the Bitcoin network. It has a built-in camera which is required for air-gap operation, and it has an optional Bluetooth compatibility. It's really a brand new user interface and user experience for a Bitcoin hardware wallet. iCoin makes self-custody accessible, easy to use, and non-intimidating. It even comes with an optional custom iCoin thermal printer so you can print out the private key and its associated QR code when you're setting up the wallet. This makes setup quick and simple. Also, it is easy to restore the wallet just by reading the seed phrase QR code with the wallet camera. And as we always talk about on this show, the only way you can truly own your Bitcoin is by having it in self-custody. So you need a device like the iCoin wallet to truly own your Bitcoin. So go to iCointechnology.com/breedlove today for 30% off the purchase of this sleek new hardware wallet. Again, that's iCointechnology.com/breedlove.
I've read these instances of certain tribes leaving goods at the border. You know, they'll kind of experimentally leave goods and see if the other tribe picks them up, and then the other tribe will reciprocate, and that it's kind of like this proto trade network thing. But if that's
and sorry, one other story of that kind. I then looked into whether or not Neanderthals did trade, and the evidence is quite strong that they didn't. So in the Caucasus, you can find Neanderthal archaeology, which is then replaced by Cro-Magnon or more modern human archaeology. And what's fascinating is that the Neanderthal tools are all made from local material, and the later ones can be made from material that comes from hundreds of miles away. So suddenly, the difference between Neanderthals had big brains, probably slightly bigger than ours. Individually, they were probably just as intelligent, but they may not have had such a big collective brain because they couldn't use trade to get hold of ideas that happened hundreds of miles away. Whereas you and I have access to a brain the size of the planet.
Right. And this back to chapter 1 in Rational Optimist, where you describe ideas themselves as being reproductive, right? Ideas having sex.
Ideas having sex is the phrase that I may be remembered for.
But there's some serious truth to it. And just to echo back that point, like what's interesting there to me is if trade does predate possibly even natural language, then that would mean that money by one definition is just the most tradable asset in any trade network. You often see this idea of cigarettes becoming money in prison, right? Because everyone wants them and they're divisible, fungible, et cetera. If that is the case, that trade does predate language that much, then presumably money does as well. And then it begs the question for me, this continuity between our activities and how our cognition comes online, right? As you were saying, that it's probable that the non-Neanderthals had trade, and that's presumably what allowed them to outcompete Neanderthals, right? That they could form,
Exactly.
larger, more prosperous, economically advantageous societies that would then eventually just supplant Neanderthal societies, presumably.
Yes, because I mean, again, just to take a specific example, Tasmania became an island around 10,000 years ago when sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age. And the people living on Tasmania at the time had the same kind of technologies as the people living on the mainland. 10,000 years later, the people on Tasmania had simpler technologies. Their technology had simplified. It had reduced in complexity because there were only about 4,000 people on the entire island. It was hard to maintain. And more important than that, they hadn't got access to the new things that were being invented on the mainland, like the boomerang, which came along after that, for example. They never got it because it was invented after the sea level rose. Now, if you compare Tasmania with Tierra del Fuego, a similarly remote, inhospitable island with a similarly small population, the same thing does not happen on Tierra del Fuego. The people of Tierra del Fuego, the Fuegians, had bows and arrows and all sorts of things by the time of Western contact. Why? Because the Magellan Strait is quite narrow, whereas the Tasman Strait, no, it's not called the Tasman Strait, the Bass Strait, is very wide. So there was continuous trading contact for Fuegians with the whole of South America, whereas Tasmanians only had a collective brain the size of Tasmania, whereas the Fuegians had a collective brain the size of South America.
Yeah, it's almost like the interconnectedness, or maybe the network density at which we are connecting with one another. It determines how much, well, not only economic prosperity, but also how many new ideas and innovations we're generating. So there was that saying that the network is the computer.
Yeah.
It's like as
I
we
think
form bigger, large, stronger networks, we actually become more
right.
computationally efficient.
And of course, the internet is the prime example of that. But you said something a minute ago which sparked a thought here, which is that the order in which things happen can be surprising, because if you we tend to think you needed a genetic mutation to make us capable of trade, and then we were able to have the benefits of trade. That's the sort of way we think about it in our head. But it might have been the other way around. And let me give you an example where we know it was the other way around. Most mammals can only digest milk as infants. The ability to produce lactase, the enzyme that deals with lactose, sugar, is switched off when you become weaned. You don't need that gene for the rest of your life because you're never going to encounter milk in your diet. In many human beings, not all, that gene remains switched on throughout life, and that enables you and I to drink milk without getting indigestion, today. Now, did we take up dairying because we'd had a mutation in our genes? No, of course not. It was the other way around. We took up dairying. We took up keeping cattle and drinking their milk even as adults because you got some nutrition. You get the protein out of milk, even if you can't digest the sugars. But that put enormous selective pressure on our genome, so that if there was a mutant person whose lactase gene didn't turn off at adulthood, he got a lot more benefit out of milk than you and I did. And so he had more genes spread into the next generation and so on. So the lactase persistent mutation was caused by a cultural change, not the other way around. Culture was the horse and the genome was the cart.
Yeah.
Now, I suspect that's true of trade and things like that too.
That is truly fascinating. And it, I think, harkens to like epigenetics as well, right? That maybe these people are just responding to as you keep consuming milk, the body realizes, hey, I need to start producing more of this lactase, and maybe that becomes a genetic. I'm no expert in this domain, but some science has said recently that a father that works out a lot might pass on certain muscle.
Yeah, I'm not convinced by that literature. I've read the epigenetics literature. There's epigenetics is a very important factor within our life. An early influence, an early experience can influence which genes get expressed in our lifetimes. But the evidence for a transmission of that signal to your children is very, very weak. There's one or two cases of people in Holland, people in Sweden, one or two cases of mice where they've thought they've picked up a signal of this, but I'm afraid I think that literature will prove to be wrong.
Got it. So that's kind of a tangential point anyway. So to keep it on nature and nurture, there is this feedback loop between them.
Exactly. And it's a myth to think of nature as unchangeable and nurture as flexible. That doesn't work either. There's all sorts of nurture influences that are inflexible. Well, nature is flexible. You and I are laying down new memories as we speak. Yeah. We're doing that by switching genes on and off in our brains, literally in real time. So that's nature, as it were, laying down these memories, right. But at the mercy of nurture.
Absolutely. Even the strict distinction between the two seems a little bit complicated when you really dig into it. That's all really good stuff. I want to talk slight shift of gears here to your book, Evolution of Everything. You said something before we pressed record that really struck a chord with me. You said that you thought perhaps Adam Smith and Darwin had been saying the same thing. Obviously, Adam Smith, a moral philosopher, but really well known for The Wealth of Nations. Charles Darwin, the father of Darwinian theory, natural selection.
Yep.
What did you mean by that? What were they saying? How are they saying the same thing?
Well, it's a little bit flippant what I'm doing here because they were both educated in Edinburgh. They both published books in the year ending 1859, the Darwin publishes The Origin of Species. 1759, Adam Smith publishes The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And I think there is a very interesting parallel between the two. Both are essentially saying, no, the change did not come about in a directed top-down way. It came about in an emergent bottom-up way. Adam Smith is talking about morality and how we get to be more moral. And in his later book, of course, he's talking about the economy and how we get to develop prosperity. But in both cases, he's arguing that this is something that emerges from the interactions of ordinary people, unconsciously, undirected, through essentially trial and error. So in the case of moral sentiments, he basically talks about how you kind of calibrate your moral sense according to what works in your society. You pick up lessons that, right, killing people is bad in this society, is it? Or in some societies, killing people is good, is it? If you're avenging them, or whatever. And he's essentially saying the priests are only telling us what we've worked out for ourselves anyway. They're not really telling us to be moral. They're just reinforcing what we are discovering for ourselves. It's a very anti-religious message in a way from Adam Smith. Now, I don't mean to put Adam Smith on a huge pedestal here, because I would say that Voltaire and Spinoza and Kant and all the other figures of the 18th century Enlightenment, going back to Locke, including Thomas Jefferson, if you like, and Benjamin Franklin, they're all kind of saying the same thing, which is now that, and David Hume, of course, particularly Smith's great friend, now that we don't think everything is made by God, let's try a an explanation for the patterns in the world that emerge, that evolve, that appear. And there's a contemporary of Adam Smith called Adam Ferguson, who is a Scottish philosopher also, who said there are things in the world that are the result of human action, but not the result. Oh gosh, I've forgotten the second half of the sentence.
Design, right? As this,
Thank you. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. This is like Hayek talks about.
So he's talking about things like language. Language. Language is full of order and structure, but there's nobody in charge.
Right. No, it's fantastic. I was just going to say that Hayek said something similar. He called it the spontaneous order, right?
Yes,
That it's
exactly
done by human effort, but not by human design.
Exactly. Thank you. That's the phrase. Yeah.
Yeah, and the metaphor I like to draw on here, and probably just because I'm a denizen of the digital age, is like these are natural language specifically, right? It's kind of like an open source software, right? That everyone can inspect it, use it, modify it even at the edges. Doesn't mean your modifications will be accepted by a consensus, but sometimes they do, right? We get new words and neologisms and new phrases and whatnot every now and then. Those, interestingly enough, this might be the where that feedback loop lives, actually. I think of things like, we'll use a phrase like, oh, that's a feature, not a bug today.
Yes.
And that
I've used that phrase twice today, and it's such a useful one.
Yeah, but 25 years ago, that would have been like, people were like, what are you talking about?
Exactly.
And
yeah.
so it's like, as our technological reality or paradigm changes, then our language changes, which is the way we're sort of cognitively gripping the world. And then through that more sophisticated language, we then are able to invent even more sophisticated tools that in turn change our language again. I don't know that this is the whole feedback loop, but it's one area where it seems to be.
No, I think that's exactly right. Like letting off steam became a metaphor in the steam age. Hoist by your own petard became a metaphor in the age of early explosions. Bootstrapping is another one. And then there's the role of metaphor in language is also huge and fascinating. So I think the evolution of language is a really rich environment and a really good way of making this point that I tried to make in Evolution of Everything, which is that there is a general theory of evolution and a special theory of evolution, just like there's a general theory of relativity and a special theory of relativity. The general theory says lots of things change spontaneously through trial and error with nobody being in charge. And the special theory says one of them is biological genetic systems.
It's really fascinating because when we say, it almost starts to become theological in a way, right? Like in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. You start to think of everything as linguistic in a way. DNA has its own software code. I wonder if there's a code to the actual fabric of reality sometimes, right? If there's
25 years ago, I wrote a book where I was completely gripped by the fact that it really is extraordinary that when we finally figured out how life was different from non-life, expecting it to be some aspect of modern quantum physics that we didn't yet understand, instead it turned out to be linear digital information. It turned out to be language. It's a 4-letter alphabet spelling out 3-letter words. Yeah. It's digital. It really does. DNA was such a surprise. You can't exaggerate how bizarre it was in 1953 to find that actually what makes a living thing living and what makes one living thing different from another is that they have spelled out different words in a language called DNA.
Yeah. That's Watson and Crick, right? 1950.
Correct. And I wrote a biography of Francis Crick, so I was particularly intrigued in that topic.
Yeah, my all my knowledge, well, most of my knowledge on this particular domain comes from Dawkins' book River Out of Eden.
Yeah, a wonderful book.
Yeah,
Really good
wonderful
book.
book. And it is so fascinating, right? It's just, well, the world is analog and continuous, but somehow life, this discontinuous, discrete, digital thing emerged from that analog, continuous soup of the world. And like, how did that happen? It's so, but they're both, yeah, they're both linguistic in a way. Yeah, it's a very strange rabbit hole that you start to look at everything
Yeah.
which like the philosophy of language becomes very fascinating to me when we go here.
I mean, there's a confusion that a lot of people have here, which when you say digital, they think you mean binary. And of
Right.
course, it's not binary, it's quaternary. It's a four-letter code, not a two-letter code. But that doesn't stop it being digital. So what we mean by digital in this context is that the letter A is the letter A. It doesn't matter whether it's in italics or capital letters or boldface, it's still the letter A. That's a digital system, as it were. And that's true for the chemical adenine, for which A is the abbreviation in the DNA code.
Yeah. And yeah, I again point people to that book. He goes into just how they're complementary, right? That the signaling system you get.
Yeah, no, what the genius, or the extraordinary thing that Watson and Crick discovered on the 28th of February 1953, which nobody had seen before, and it became immediately obvious, is that any sequence of letters is possible in any order, and it automatically predicts the sequence on the opposite chain, and therefore you've got a mechanism for copying messages, and therefore you've discovered how replication works, which is the secret of life.
Yes, yes, yes. Yeah. Darwin uses, when you Xerox the copy of the Xerox so many times, it gets blurry. But somehow
Exactly.
the
Yeah,
digital.
you said Darwin. I think you meant Dawkins, but
Oh,
I'm
Dawkins,
sure
sorry,
I'm
Dawkins.
sure he'd be happy with the confusion.
Yeah, it's again excellent book on that.
Forget multivitamins and other supplements. Animal organs are the most nutrient dense foods on the planet. You can get 100 times more nutrients from organs than you can from muscle meats. But the problem with eating organs is that they are difficult to find in stores, they are difficult to prepare, and even when they are prepared well, they often don't taste great. Thankfully, Heart and Soil Supplements has made consuming organ meats so much easier by providing powderized organs in capsule form. Organ meats include everything your body needs to thrive: vitamins, minerals, peptides, proteins, and growth factors. This is why organ meats were the most prized foods for our ancestors. Fortunately for us, Heart and Soil makes these treasured foods easily accessible. So go to heartandsoil.co today and use discount code BREEDLOVE to get started on your journey to optimal health and vitality. Again, that's heartandsoil.co, discount code BREEDLOVE. Have you ever wanted to start a business in the Bitcoin space? If so, then the Wolf Startup Accelerator could be for you. Wolf is the first startup accelerator dedicated exclusively to businesses developing in the Bitcoin Lightning Network. 4 times each year, Wolf brings teams from around the world to New York City to work with like-minded entrepreneurs, pushing the boundaries of what's possible with Bitcoin and Lightning. The program is designed to help early-stage companies achieve product-market fit, develop their brand, secure early-stage funding, and grow businesses that fuel the global adoption of Bitcoin. Go to wolfnyc.com to learn more or apply today. Again, that's Wolf, WOLF, NYC.com.
Let me ask you this then. So this obviously we're still in your book, Evolution of Everything, somewhat. This, as I said to you offline, I don't know if this is a direct quote of yours or just inspired by you, but I have referred to evolution as biological innovation and innovation as non-biological evolution. And also influenced by the thinker I mentioned to you, Bajan, who wrote The Physics of Life. He has a theory around this as well. They're basically the same process occurring in different material substrates. One, the quote unquote inorganic domain of, metals and plastics and all the things we build stuff with, and then the organic domain of blood, flesh, bone, etc.
Mhm.
How do you, that's a bold claim, I think, that there's deep continuity between these two domains.
Mhm.
May also attest to that feedback loop again that we're describing.
Mhm.
How do you unpack that idea, or what do you think about that?
I think there's two really key points here. One of which is an objection to my theory that I've got an answer to, and the other of which is the sort of underlying similarity. The underlying similarity is entropy.
Hmm.
The whole idea of thermodynamics is that the world is a chaotic and disordered place. If you want to make it more ordered, you have to put energy into it. That's what life does. We harness energy from originally the sun through the plants, which are eaten by the animals and so on. We harness that energy to create ordered structures, bodies with, two eyes in the right place and a mouth in the right place and that kind of thing. So that's that. We're using energy to locally reverse entropy. So is an innovator. So is somebody who is inventing a computer or something like that. He's taking grains of sand and turning them into silicon chips of an ordered, improbable, unlikely, useful structure. And he's doing so by harnessing energy. And so in that sense, there's this deep, deep similarity. And if you think of the nest of a bird as being an ordered structure produced outside the bird, then how is it any different from a house being an ordered structure produced outside the human being? But you could object, well, hang on, it is different because the human being sits down and designs the house, whereas the bird's nest is a product of its instinct, is an evolved thing that emerged bottom up. And my response to that is, well, hang on a minute. I flew across the Atlantic in an airplane last month. That airplane was designed by some smart people at the Boeing company or the Airbus company, whichever it was. And I hope they were intelligent designers. But were they really designing it, or were they adapting a previous design, which was adapting a previous design, which was adapting a previous design, incorporating elements that improved it, dropping elements that didn't? So sometime in the 1950s, the designers of jet aircraft had a series of crashes, and they discovered that square windows in airplanes are a bad idea because that's where metal fatigue starts. So trial and error, they found out that you should have rounded windows in airplanes. I bet you didn't know, well, that's why we had them, but that is why we have them. And so on, all the way back to the Wright brothers. And the Wright brothers themselves designed their flyer by a ton of experiments. They did trial and error with gliders for 3 years before they even put an engine on one. And so, in a real sense, we are evolving our technologies in much the same way that wildlife is evolving its bodily structures. So the role of human intention in innovation is rather less important than we think.
Yeah, well, again, there's that distributed cognition, but it's also occurring not just across space and the present, but across time, as you're saying, right? There's
Yes.
this march of incremental improvement on the original, I don't know, the original innovation. It's like the innovation, I don't know where do you draw the line, right? What is the original innovation of flight? I mean, I guess you would say when the plane left the ground, but the
Right.
glider before it.
December 1903, but that was the culmination of a long process of iterative improvement, as well as the beginning of a long process of further improvement. And
Yes.
by the way, neither of them had college degrees.
Yeah, yeah. The tinkerers are always
Yes, exactly.
that make the breakthroughs. Yeah, I've heard this. It's also been described, I think, by Bejan, it could be someone else. He called it the algorithm of evolution, that if it works, keep it. If it doesn't, discard it, right? And just that iterative process.
Absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. And I don't think I did invent that phrase you used a few minutes ago. And I can't remember what it was exactly, but it's very much the point I'm trying to make, that innovation and evolution are essentially very similar processes, and of course this is where I got my ideas having sex point, because one thing evolution depends upon is sexual reproduction, bringing together genetic innovations from different lineages. Right. It's no good if you're trying to invent a mammal. Well, okay, you're trying to evolve a mammal and you want it to have fur, but you also want it to have milk. It's no good if one lineage has got fur and the other's got milk and they can't breed together. Yeah. But if they can reproduce so that one of the offspring has both fur and milk, then you're going to cumulatively accumulate benefits in that way. And so sex plays a vital role in evolution. But exchange plays exactly the same role in innovation. It brings together inventions that occur in different islands or different continents or different times. And so exchange is playing the role of sex in innovation.
Yeah, no, fantastic. And there's the principle, right? It's the sexual selection is increasing the intensity of exchange, right? You're getting more recombinations of genetics.
It's all about recombination. Just to give you my favorite example of ideas having sex, there's a thing called a pill camera, which if you swallow it, it takes a film of your insides, which the doctor can download. I don't think it's a very successful technology, but it was invented 25 years ago or something. And it came about after a conversation over a garden fence in Boston between a gastroenterologist and a guided missile designer. That's the kind of thing I mean by ideas having sex. Unlikely combinations of ideas that when you put them together produce brand new ideas. Yeah.
Yeah, and herein lies probably the magic of cities and urban density too, right? That you get more.
Absolutely.
You get a higher pressure cauldron for these ideas to intermingle and date, I guess, and have sex. And the serendipity of the gastroenterologist talking to the guided missile designer, like you get more of those opportunities in a more urbanly dense environment.
More promiscuity, I'm afraid. But yes, there you go.
Okay, I want to ask you this then, and sorry if this is maybe a bit too philosophical, but it's something that I've been wrestling with, because you do end up on these lines of thinking, dealing with very primordial concepts like energy and entropy. And as you said, both evolution and innovation are really characterized by the fact that they are anti-entropic, right? They're turning chaos into order. The difference being energy and entropy, right? That they're converting that entropy into energy.
Well, they're using energy to turn entropy into order. Is a better way of putting it, I think.
My question is,
the thermodynamics laws are quite hard to get your head around, actually.
Yes,
but
they are.
That's a simplistic way of putting it.
And this is where I've also found it interesting that there's sort of two different versions of entropy. There's like the Claude Shannon communication theory version of entropy, and then there's the thermodynamic version of entropy. And they're related, but I don't think they're exactly the same. And so I was wondering if you could just toy with that a little bit. Like what is the relationship between energy and entropy? Because I've heard it put that energy, how was this put? Entropy is useless energy, and energy is useful entropy. So the very the crude example I would give is, the feces of the cow that's waste to the cow, that's entropy, right? That's that's not useful to them, but that's energy to the fly, right? Like it's food to the fly. So are we just kind of assigning a utility function to these things and then giving them these fancy thermodynamic or information theoretic names, or are these real quantities in the real world that we're dealing with?
No, I think these are real, and I think they're deeply fundamental and incredibly important, and bitterly misunderstood in some ways. There's Douglas Adams, the author of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, who is a friend of mine. He had in one part of that book, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, there is a spacecraft which is driven by an infinite improbability drive. And in one of my books, I toyed with this as a sort of metaphor for what innovation is. It's an infinite improbability drive. Its job is to generate improbability. So that the atoms in the Eiffel Tower are arranged in the way they are so that the thing stands up on its own is unbelievably improbable. If you threw them together, it would never happen. So the usefulness of the Eiffel Tower as a symbol or a place to go and visit or whatever is the fact that it's anti-entropic, it's improbable, it's the product of using energy to create useful order. And that's sort of what we do in our everyday life. And by the way, it's why the energy industry is so absolutely fundamental, I think, to our living standards. I constantly argue that it was the extraordinary availability and productivity of fossil fuels that transformed our prospects as a species. We had plenty of innovation bursts before in, Song China or Abbasid Arabia or Renaissance Italy, but the one that really took off was the 18th, 19th century in basically Britain and Northern Europe, and then America, which was all about harnessing huge quantities of energy, a very cheap energy, increasingly cheap energy, and still we're 80% dependent on oil, gas, and coal for generating that energy. And I have a particular interest in going back and looking at the medieval economy and trying to understand how it worked. And I found some papers the other day about a bishop in England in the 1350s who's immensely wealthy, and he's building a new cathedral and all this kind of thing. But he's doing so on the back of an agricultural economy, which he owns large chunks of. And on his farms, because the records are so good, we can see how well the farming went. And in a decent year, you would sow 1 grain of wheat in the ground and get 4 back. In a good year, you'd get 5. In a bad year, you'd get 3. Now, you've got to keep one of those back to sow the next year. So you're left with 3 in an average year. Now, out of those 3 grains per grain sown, you've got to feed the farmer, you've got to feed the bishop and all his monks and things, you've got to feed the carter and all this, you've got to feed the horse, etc., and you've got to feed them well enough so they can build a castle or a new cathedral or whatever it is. So you're trying to generate improbable structures of a useful kind from really quite a marginal energy out for energy in, as it were. Now, I have a farm here in northern England. We grow wheat. When we put a grain in the ground, we expect to get 100 back.
Wow.
That's quite a difference.
Wow.
That's 99 that I don't have to keep back for sowing, 99 that are available to supply me with all the things I need. And it doesn't, and I'm not even relying on wheat for my transport. I get that from an oil well originally. I'm not even relying on it for my heat. I get that from gas or my log stove or whatever. I'm not even relying on it for any of the mechanical work that I'm going to do if I rebuild my house or something like that, that's going to come again from, gas, oil, whatever, to some extent nuclear and wind and things like that as well. But so do you see what I mean? I just think that once you think in these thermodynamic terms, in terms of energy input to energy output, it enables you to look at the economic system in a fresh way.
Absolutely. Yeah, it all comes down to the economics ultimately, right? Because it's what allows it to, well, be either profitable, profitable, right? Either in a Darwinian life energy sense or even in a financial sense, if you're looking
Yeah,
at
exactly. And or to put it at its crudest, the Bishop of Winchester in 1350 could be rich, but only he could be. Whereas today we can all be rich.
Yes, exactly. So the increase in that crop yield from 4, you described 1 expecting a yield of 4, but a net 3 to 100. Is that GMOs? Is that knowledge? Is that technique? Like what all's baked into that increase?
It's a really good question. And a big part of it is fertilizer, synthetic nitrogen fertilizer made usually with natural gas. Basically trebles your yield.
Which is also giving the plant more energy, right? Kind of the same principle at work.
Yes, it's basically enabling the plant to use the sunlight more efficiently because it's not limited by nitrogen. But then it's GMOs, and well, it's not GMOs because we haven't actually genetically modified wheat much. It's the plant that's been hardest to get GMOs going in, but it is selective breeding, and in particular, and this goes back to a series of brilliant discoveries in the 1940s, and the name Norman Borlaug, who would have been 111 yesterday, is a key figure in this, a brilliant American plant breeder. What they were all about was dwarfing the wheat, finding these genes that enabled the wheat to grow much less tall, and that enabled it to devote more of its energy into seeds and less into stalks. But it also meant that it didn't blow over when there was a storm so easily, which it did if you planted it densely, and you planted it densely when you got fertilizer. So this shortening made wheat much better at responding to fertilizer without sort of crashing, as it were. So then, sorry, there are other things: the tractor, the pesticides, the all the techniques for improving the yield are all sort of all over the place. So it's a multifaceted thing, but very little of it could happen without fossil fuels, or at least lots of energy.
Yes, and lots of trade, right? Lots of trade.
And lots of trade. So that dwarfing gene that Borlaug used was discovered at the end of World War II in Japan in a research station by an American agronomist called Cecil Salmon, who brought it back, showed it to a guy called Orville Vogel. He crossed it with some American varieties. Borlaug heard about it from him and went and got it and crossed it with some other varieties. He persuaded Mexican farmers to use it. He dramatically increased the yield in Mexico. He then went to India and Pakistan and did the same. India went from famine to overabundance in a few years, almost entirely because of that one gene. It's the most extraordinary story. And by the way, I think Borlaug probably saved more lives than any other human being on the planet.
Wow. Amazing. So there it is again, that incrementalism at work.
Yes.
I think it was you too, perhaps, that you used, and forgive me if I'm misattributing here, but the metaphor of like when a good idea is discovered, it sort of like can become a wildfire, right? Like you're just describing, that he figures out how to increase crop yields in one place, and then all of a sudden, boom, especially in the age of telecommunications, that it just spreads rapidly. And in the age of the internet, these wildfires burn even more quickly and more intensely. And so, yeah, it's interesting. It's really interesting.
Yeah. Now, I have used the phrase bushfire quite often for this kind of thing. Trouble is, it's a slightly destructive metaphor.
Yeah, right. Yeah. But also, creative, right? It's the forest fire that clears out the underbrush for new growth and whatnot. And
Well, that's true. The Schumpeter idea of creative destruction is absolutely vital here too.
yes, yes.
Would you rather have 1 Bitcoin today or 2 Bitcoin a few years from now? Bitcoin mining is a tried and true strategy for accumulating Bitcoin. Over a 2 to 4 year time frame, successful miners have consistently accumulated more Bitcoin than they otherwise would with a traditional dollar cost average strategy. Blockware mining as a service enables you to start mining Bitcoin from your laptop. Blockware handles everything from securing the miners to sourcing low-cost power to configuring the mining pool. They do it all. Plus, with Blockware's one-of-a-kind mining marketplace, you can buy and sell live Bitcoin miners with just a few keystrokes. In this marketplace, buyers get to purchase live machines at vetted facilities, enabling them to mine with zero lead time. And sellers get the opportunity to liquidate their machines and hosting contracts at will. This means you can mine Bitcoin with zero long-term commitment and high liquidity on your mining rigs. Blockware will even cover your energy bill for 1 week per mining rig when you sign up at mining.blockwaresolutions.com/breedlove. Again, that's 1 free week of Bitcoin mining at mining.blockwaresolutions.com/breedlove. And on top of this offer, you can also use code BREEDLOVE to get $100 off your first mining rig with Blockware Solutions. Bitcoin custody is evolving. Both self-custody and single third-party custody come with significant risk and trade-offs. OnRamp is pioneering a new standard, multi-institution custody, which eliminates single points of failure, adding fault tolerance and redundancy to your setup. OnRamp secures your Bitcoin in a segregated cold storage multi-sig vault guarded by 3 independent institutional-grade custodians, none of which that have unilateral control over your assets. More than just security, OnRamp simplifies inheritance and estate planning, ensuring your Bitcoin wealth moves seamlessly to your loved ones without the risk and complexities of self-custody. Easily designate beneficiaries right in the OnRamp dashboard, eliminating the need for unreliable treasure maps or other complex key-sharing schemes. You can also avoid the probate process and ensure your heirs receive their Bitcoin securely with legal title transfers designed to keep your wealth intact for generations. As Bitcoin continues to appreciate, OnRamp helps you seamlessly access financial services, from inheritance and insurance to trading, loans, IRAs, and more, all without compromising on security. And importantly, the onboarding process is fast and frictionless. I set up my own OnRamp account, and it was far easier than dealing with hardware wallets or traditional self-custody setups. The team walked me through everything step by step, making sure I had a secure, reliant setup for my Bitcoin wealth. Secure your generational wealth with confidence. Schedule a consultation with the OnRamp team today at onrampbitcoin.com/breedlove. Again, that's onrampbitcoin.com/breedlove.
You mentioned you read a book recently about Proto-Indo-European language. Maybe it was more than that, but you said you learned a bit about Proto-Indo-European language, which is near the trunk of the tree of language, right? This is, I think Sanskrit is one derivation of Proto-Indo-European. I've found a lot of fascination in tracing the etymology of words back to, oftentimes they go back to the Latin derivation, at least when you're looking at English words. But I think if you go deeper and look at the Sanskrit or Proto-Indo-European origins, you get a lot of insights about how ideas and concepts have evolved over time and
Yeah.
different interconnectedness between words and ideas. And you mentioned earlier that language itself is this emergent, evolving thing. And we alluded even that reality itself is perhaps language-like. Could you just play with those ideas a little bit? What are your thoughts about natural language and its course of evolution?
Well, I have to be a little bit careful because the book I'm referring to hasn't been published yet, and I shouldn't, as it were, steal its thunder. But I was asked to read it and comment on it. It's called Proto. I can't immediately remember the author's name, but It's a beautiful book, and I'm really looking forward to it coming out, because it is basically about the Proto-Indo-European language, which is this, as you say, common language from Ireland to Bengal, spoken by almost everybody in that space except the Basques, the Hungarians, the Estonians, the Finns, and a few others. It turns out that all these languages, the Germanic languages, the Latin languages, the Indian languages, the not the Semitic languages, not the Arabic languages. This huge swathe of Western Asia and Europe basically has one language family tree. Now, that in itself is a fascinating discovery that was made a long time ago. That's not a new discovery. But what they're able to do now, and is done beautifully in this book, is put flesh on the bones of that theory, work out when it happened, relatively recently. I mean, it's something like 6,000 years ago, and is that right? Or is it 6,000 BC? No, I think that's about right. I think about 4,000 BC. Yeah. And where it came from as an individual language and what its words were. And we can literally reconstruct some of the words of that language. Now, I don't think I'm giving too much away by saying that. It comes from an area north of the Black Sea, and it's a steppe people, it's a pastoral people who impose it on the rest of Europe, displacing the languages of the cultivators, the farmers, which is slightly surprising. You'd think it might be the other way around, it's a magnificent example of using existing languages, because we have no fossils of this language. We have a few written words and things from times past, but mostly we're talking about comparing existing languages and reading the archaeological record and reading the genetic record, and that's where this book is so clever. It brings those three strands together. But we are able to tell a great deal about the history of a subject because we understand its evolution. Yes. And that, for me, is fascinating. And aided by ancient DNA studies, which have made enormous strides in recent years, we are able to explore the past in a way that other generations have not been able to do. And that's really exciting, I think. The future is exciting, but the past is also very exciting these days.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I found it to be, going through the etymological origins of words, you almost see like the evolution of our conceptual landscapes, because these words will change meanings over time, or there'll be unanticipated connections between words. There's many, many examples. I'll just pick one. The word context, for instance, is derived from a word that has something to do with weaving, right? Like the actual act of weaving a basket.
Right.
And so context has always been a very fascinating word to me because, con means to bring together, and text obviously is related to words or language. But context is much broader than just language, right? It's like the circumstances and milieu that you're acting within. And it's something about like the weaving together of all those strands to understand what the event is that you're examining. Like if it's taken out of context, then you might not understand what's really happening. Just picking one of.
Well, I mean, just the sentence you just issued had about 8 metaphors in it, I suspect.
Yes, yeah. And metaphor, I've become deeply fascinated with metaphor.
George Lakoff wrote a wonderful book called The Metaphors. Metaphors We Live By. That's right.
Yes, yeah. I've read that one and have since ordered many other books on metaphor. The cognitive, what do they call it? The cognitive theory of metaphor, that actually cognition has a metaphorical architecture to it, which I don't have my head around at all yet, but it is fascinating. It's much more than linguistic. We know it's more than linguistic. We know that it is at least operating at the conceptual level, but it may be even operating at the neurobiological level, which is strange to me.
I think that's exactly right. I've often had that thought, that that if I was deprived of metaphor, I wouldn't understand very much about the world.
Yes, it's almost like trying to imagine or think what it would be like to think without natural language. It's so,
Yes, which is equally difficult.
yes,
Yes.
yes. Okay, I'll flip over now to your latest book, Birds, Sex, and Beauty. You're saying this book has, and I haven't read this one yet, so forgive me, but this one has a lot to do with sexual selection and its role in evolutionary biology.
Yeah.
What inspired you to write this book, and what questions were you trying to answer?
Well, partly I wanted an excuse to go bird watching. I like birds, but partly, and also I used to study them a long time ago, and this was a return to my roots. But partly I just wanted to revisit this really interesting evolutionary dichotomy that Darwin was obsessed by. And so there's a lot about the history of evolutionary thought in this book. Darwin said there is natural selection, known as survival of the fittest, although I don't think he coined that phrase. If you're better than the other chap at surviving, then you have more influence on the next generation, and so your genes spread at his expense. And then he said there is also sexual selection or mate choice, which is that usually females, in the case of birds, are selecting males for their beauty as well, or their song, as well as for their prowess or their survival ability. And in some cases, they're actually making it harder for them to survive. And he puzzled about this, and he wrote a whole book about it, and he thought about it a lot more, funnily enough, than he did about sexual selection in the 1860s. He's thinking about nothing else but sexual selection. And he's saying it's not the same as natural selection because it often hinders survival but helps reproduction. Mm-hmm. And all of his contemporaries said, you're talking through your hat, you don't know what you're talking about. Birds don't have a sense of beauty. They're too stupid. Anyway, females don't choose their mates. Males choose their mates. Look at human beings. You know, all these Victorian things got in the way. And they were kind of embarrassed. And his best colleague on natural selection, Alfred Russel Wallace, said, you know, I'm sorry, you're just wrong. The colors of birds are nothing to do with males trying to charm females. Well, Wallace was wrong and Darwin was right. We now know that basically these colorful, extravagant plumages emerge through the process of females, for some reason, preferring extravagant plumage. And it's just like a dog breeder or a chicken breeder breeding new breed of chickens or dogs. It's the females who are doing it to the males, and Darwin kept using that analogy. And what he didn't have was a good explanation of why. Why should beauty matter to female birds? And he was mocked for this. You know, a lot of people said, "Well, don't be ridiculous. You know, how could they possibly get any benefit from choosing a colourful husband?" And a guy called Fisher in the 20th century came up with a very good answer to it, which I still don't think we take fully seriously enough. And that is that it might be because the colours tell you that he's stronger and has a better immune system and more disease resistant. And that's the idea that most people stick with to this day. But Fisher said, no, it might be that the genes she's after from this male are the genes for seduction, because she doesn't want to have a son that can't attract females. So she's got to follow the fashion. She's got to go for the exaggerated tail of the peacock, because if she finds a big butch peacock with no tail attractive, she's going to have sons who don't get to seduce any females. So the whole thing is a circular argument. Yeah, and therefore it can go in any direction. And therefore it explains the complete randomness of bird colors. They can be red or blue or yellow or orange. They can exaggerate the tail or the crest or the wings or the breast, or, you know, there's any part of the plumage can go in any direction and produce any kind of color, which doesn't look like a system that is in a utilitarian way, trying to express the strength and solidity of the male. It looks like just a mad fashion system that's gone crazy like fashion.
Sounds like art or fashion. Yes, yes.
It's very like fashion and art. Exactly.
That is so fascinating. What's the role, if any, of costly signaling theory in this?
Yeah.
If you could maybe describe what that is as well for people that.
Yeah. Well, there's the version of that evolutionary biologists took very seriously in the 70s, 80s, 90s. It's called handicap theory, and essentially it's saying that the peacock is saying, look, I have to carry this enormous tail around, and when I spread it out, I can't see behind me, so a leopard could creep up and kill me. I've nonetheless survived. Therefore, I must have really good genes, so please mate with me.
Mm-hmm.
And the human equivalent of that is therefore a chap who says, I've just spent $1,400 on a bottle of wine.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Think how rich I must be if I can throw that kind of money away.
Ridiculous consumption. Yes, yes.
So you should marry me.
Yeah.
And I think they're essentially similar ideas. Now, I think if the peacock actually is seducing the female with his long tail because the female needs to breed sons with long tails, or otherwise her sons won't get to mate, then actually that doesn't coincide with costly signaling theory, as it were. So I think it shows that a peacock's tail is not like a man's Lamborghini in that sense, because I think it's unlikely that women are mating with flamboyantly rich men so that they can have flamboyantly rich sons.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you see what I mean, So actually, I'm a bit of a skeptic of how relevant costly signaling theory is here. I think it probably does play a part in animals, but less so than it does in humans.
Got it. Yeah. Well, the economic argument of that is compelling to me. That, like you were describing earlier, when you have this excess, an economic surplus, basically, that's what allows an organism to thrive. So
Yes.
if you're just sort of
Yes.
visually demonstrating that economic surplus, oh, I'm the peacock with all the shiny feathers, or I'm the guy with a nice watch and nice car, that may be a subliminal signal or inducement to mate. You're just saying, hey, I've got all these extra resources, come reproduce with me. And then maybe for the female, maybe she does want to have those sons that also have, because that would mean her genes have a higher likelihood of being passed on.
Well, I think for my book is not about human beings. At one point I say, look, boring brown African apes are not nearly as interesting as beautiful blue birds.
But Dawkins share that one. That's so funny that you guys that are into evolutionary biology seem least interested in
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
We're just yet another mammal, really. But the one area where I think my friend and colleague Jeffrey Miller has made a really interesting argument.
He's been on the show as well too. Scale.
Okay.
Scale,
yeah,
right?
Exactly. Jeffrey's very smart.
I'm sorry. That's Jeffrey West. Sorry, who's Jeffrey?
Oh, yeah. Jeffrey Miller is an evolutionary biologist. Well, funnily enough, he's also in Albuquerque, which is where Jeffrey West is, I think. But anyway, he wrote a book called The Mating Mind in the year 2000. And he makes the argument that the explosion in the size of the human mind is hard to explain.
Mm-hmm.
It happened relatively quickly. It didn't happen in any other species. Now, the one thing we know about sexual selection is it can result in runaway rapid evolution. The peacock's tail probably became big in a relatively short period.
Right.
Maybe the human mind is the product of sexual selection rather than natural selection. In other words, the enormous brain we've got in our head is only quite useful for helping us survive on the savannah. But it's very useful for seducing members of the other sex, because how else do you explain wit and humor and linguistic extravagance and art and all these other sort of kind of useless things that we devote a huge amount of our mental energy to? And so he's saying, look, we might have got big brains because it helped us survive on the savannah, but then why didn't it happen to baboons? We might have got big brains because it enabled us to survive, to understand what's going on in large social groups, but then why didn't that happen to chimpanzees? We might have got big brains because one sex or the other, or both, decided that intelligence was something they wanted to be attracted by and pass on to their children so that their children would be attractive to members of the opposite sex. It's not a proven theory, but his point is, why is it not just as valid as the other hypotheses?
Yeah, it's hard, like difficult to think of a way to unravel that.
Exactly.
It's very difficult. Like I can't imagine an experiment. I don't know. It's very mysterious. I guess I'll just leave it at that.
That is the real problem, is that and theories are to a penny in science.
Yeah.
Good experiments to test them are much more valuable, and it lacks that way of doing it. Yeah.
One of my highest health priorities is keeping my brain in top shape. To take care of my brain power, I do many things, such as striving to read, write, exercise, and meditate daily. One of the latest tools in my brain power toolkit is MindLab Pro. MindLab Pro is a nootropic supplement that is scientifically proven to enhance your brain power. When I take MindLab Pro, my mind feels like it has a better grip on the world, my thinking is more lucid, and the articulation of my speech is radically improved. MindLab Pro has been tested in rigorous, double-blind, placebo-controlled human trials and has been proven to enhance brain power for users in every age group. MindLab Pro is an advanced formulation of 11 nootropic ingredients and is backed by research from over 1,400 human trials conducted over the past 32 years. So if you're looking to enhance your brain power, MindLab Pro is an excellent solution. Go to mindlabpro.com/breedlove to start enhancing your brain power today. Again, that's mindlabpro.com/breedlove. If you're listening to this podcast, you probably get it. You get that Bitcoin upends everything that state-sponsored schools teach us about money. For those who get the importance of Bitcoin, it is important that we have a smart way to buy and hold Bitcoin. My friends at Coinbits, the oldest Bitcoin-only exchange in the United States, have pioneered the concept of roundups, which converts your spare change into Bitcoin. Simply connect your credit or debit cards, and your usual purchases are rounded up to the nearest dollar, letting you stack sats on every purchase without even thinking about it. Coinbits also provides a terrific self-custody experience. Connect a hardware wallet for automatic withdrawals into cold storage to minimize your risk and stay sovereign over your Bitcoin. My favorite Coinbits feature is Coinbits Plus, which gives you the best exchange rate on Bitcoin. It even gives you real-time feedback on how well you are doing on your savings plan. With Coinbits Plus, power users can save more money to buy even more Bitcoin. All that, plus peer-to-peer cash and Bitcoin payments, target orders, price alerts, and more means Coinbits can help you do almost anything you need to do with Bitcoin. So go to coinbits.app/breedlove to sign up today. Again, that is Coinbits, BITS.app/breedlove.
The other thing we were talking about before we hit record that I've always found to be very fascinating, some of this is, as I mentioned to you, drawing from the thinking of John Vervaeke, who uses the term transjective rather than subjective or objective, that there are many things that are not so easily reducible to either purely subjective or purely objective. You've already alluded to this in your conversation on this topic so far, but evolution itself right? That the selection pressures are clearly objective, right? Like you go into the world and you either live or die, right? The adaptation either works or it doesn't. You know, you either pass the genes on to the next generation or you don't. So there's a very objective filtering criteria in nature that nature, the pressure nature is exerting on the organism. But then there's also this subjective element, which is the sexual selection you're describing, right? Like what do in largely the females, at least for mammals, it sounds like, what features do they select for in mates? And so what is it? Then what is evolution? Evolution is the result of both of these things in confluence. Well, then it's neither purely objective selection pressures nor purely subjective sexual selection. It's some confluence of the two. Therefore, it's a transjective phenomenon.
I think I hadn't heard this word until you mentioned it to me earlier, and I think it's actually a very important insight. I'm gonna borrow it because, yeah, as you say, is a peacock's tail that emerges in a peacock the result of an objective selection criterion? Well, yes, because whatever it happened, it just happened without anyone intending it to happen. There's nothing conscious or directed about it, and the selection did happen. It was it was objectively true that females were preferring longer tails. But the fact that we're here talking about a conscious, intelligent animal discriminating on purpose among potential mates, which, by the way, Darwin makes I can't remember the quote, but he makes a very clear point about this. He's saying, this is really intriguing because it means there are there's a subjectivity, there's a deliberateness about this, which isn't quite the same as natural selection. And of course, he draws very close parallels with pigeon breeders, bantam breeders, plant breeders, who are deliberately selecting for certain things, but are but are doing so through a mechanism that is basically evolution. And if I may, I just want to segue from there to a case that I've also been writing about and obsessing about in recent years, which is this question of where the COVID virus came from.
Yes.
Because Alina Chan and I wrote a book called Viral, in which we looked into the search for the origin of COVID and came to the conclusion that a lab leak is very possible, perhaps even very probable. And I've since come to the conclusion that it's close to being much the most likely hypothesis. But getting your head around how that might work is quite difficult, because if you look at the genome of a virus, can you tell whether it evolved or whether it was synthesized? No. There are all sorts of ways in which those two categories could overlap. But more importantly, is there a process that is sort of halfway between the two, that is transjective, to use your word? Yes, there is. It's called passaging. And it's when you take a virus and you infect it into human cells, and it turns out to be very bad at that. But then you get a few viruses back out of the cell and you infect those into human cells, and it's a little bit better at it, and so on. Now, this is evolution. This is survival of the fittest virus, as it were, but you're deliberately making it happen. And after a few generations of this, you've got a virus that's very infectious. And this might explain why COVID was so extraordinarily infectious from the get-go, unlike almost any other animal virus we've had enter our species. This blurred boundary between the objective and the subjective is, I think, a really important idea.
Yeah, it feels very close to how reality actually works. Like there are these actual fitness relationships between things, and even subjective, objective. I mean, this is all an inheritance, right, of Descartes, right? I think, therefore I am. So therefore we bifurcated the world into thinking subject and objective world. But the reality is not like that. It's
Yeah.
continuous, right?
Yeah.
And so even subjective objective duality seems like a categorical structure we formulated as an adaptive organism to decomplexify the world. But beneath that is the reality that things are tend to be more transjective than simply, bifurcated into subject or object. Um, what Okay, I'm sorry, I'm going to say a couple things about COVID here, and I always refer to it as the plandemic, and I'll try to explain why.
Ah.
Um, so for me, I have a younger brother he has a master's degree in biomolecular chemical biology. He's a very uh, studious young man. He's very intelligent. And at the time of this pandemic, he was saying, I've read the research, it's all good. The jab is the right thing to do. He was encouraging myself and others to get it. And for me, not having any of that background or that specialized knowledge, I made my decision to not get the jab and to not have anyone to encourage everyone in my family not to get it. I made sure that my direct family did not get it. Was based purely on the heuristic. There's a business heuristic that if the product is free, then you are the product. And so when I saw them pushing this
Yeah.
thing, free Happy Meals, free this, it wasn't just a free product. They were giving you incentives to take the free product.
Mhm.
And so for me, that heuristic was strong enough to tell me to run for my life, like avoid that thing at all costs. And I think as it turns out, I was labeled as an anti-vaxxer and conspiracy theorist, all that at the time, but I think in the fullness of time, we've more or less been proven correct. Um, and then one other thing I want to say about COVID, when I did actually get it, it was myself, my daughter, and the mother of my daughter had it. We all had different symptom sets.
Mhm.
And that was very strange. Like I kind of had the lethargy and body aches. The mother of my daughter had like the cough and hoarseness and then loss of smell. My daughter had pretty mild symptoms. Um, and anecdotally for me, like based on the way I was feeling and the way I saw that we all had exhibited different symptoms, my intuition was telling me it was engineered. I'm like, I've never had a sickness in a family that we're all not dealing with approximately the same symptoms. These were just widely divergent. And so I don't even know if that holds water or not. It just was again kind of anecdotal in my own experience, but
Yeah,
uh,
my gut tells me that you were wrong about that for the simple reason that before this pandemic, we never knew what bug we'd got.
mm,
I mean, well, unless you got sort of malaria or something, on the whole, a cold was a cold. There are about 200 different kinds of viruses that cause human colds. You know that some colds were different from others. Probably some of them were coronavirus colds, some of them were adenovirus colds, some of them were rhinovirus colds. Do you know what I mean? And if we'd known exactly which one we had each time we had a cold, we'd have noticed that the symptoms were different in different people anyway. So I suspect I don't myself see how that tells you it was engineered. On the vaccine point, I did get vaccinated 3 times. I then got COVID 3 times after all my vaccinations. I had a bad reaction to one of the vaccines, but not to the other two. I, on the whole, think vaccination has saved a lot of lives, but I was appalled by the way they overclaimed for this vaccine. They said it would stop transmission, and it doesn't. They said it was safe for children, and it probably isn't because children were at very, very low risk from COVID, etc. And I could see what was happening, which was that they were playing into the hands of, I'm not going to say people like you, but playing into the hands of anti-vaxxers who, Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s popularity went through the roof, etc. And that was going to backfire on other vaccines, which probably are safer. And it's even backfired to the extent it's made me think I need to go back and look at the evidence for a lot of the vaccines that I did assume were safe and important. If it's made me, someone who was basically pro-vax, have doubts, then think what it's done to people who were suspicious of medics anyway, people who in minority communities and things like this. So I'm horrified by how a lot of things were handled in the pandemic. We were lied to about numerous things. They told us it wasn't airborne. The World Health Organization put out statements saying it is not airborne. Like, not was in capital letters. Well, I'm sorry, but it was airborne, and they never really apologized for getting that wrong. They told us that masks were effective. There's no good evidence that masks made much difference either way. They might have done, but it's unlikely, etc. So yes, it is it's an experience that has damaged the reputation of science significantly, and that for me is a pity. But the biggest damage of all was assuring us 100% in the early months that they knew for certain that it was not a lab accident. And these were people who we now know from their private meetings, from their private exchanges, had very good reason to think that it was a lab accident. Amongst themselves, they were saying things like, it looks frigging likely that it did come out of that lab. And then they were publishing papers saying the very opposite. Now, that is the worst scientific scandal of my lifetime, and it is, and I feel quite personal about it, because I was on the Science and Technology Select Committee in the House of Lords in the UK Parliament at the time. We were looking into this. We were assured that there was no evidence this came from a lab. We read the papers, the two papers in particular, one in the Lancet, one in Nature Medicine, saying, no, it didn't come out from a lab. And then so I went around telling people, no, it didn't. And then I began to look into it. And particularly through the work of Alina Chan, who became a co-author on this, we both said, well, hang on, there's some funny things here. It's very well adapted to human beings from the get-go. It contains a thing called a furin cleavage site never seen before in a SARS-like coronavirus, but which was subject to, which they were putting into viruses in Wuhan, among other places. It came from a city with one of 40,000 markets in China, but one lab, the only lab in the world that was doing manipulation experiments on SARS-like coronaviruses from bats. It came from 10 miles from the lab that had the 9 closest relatives of that virus in its freezer at the time of the outbreak. I mean, the coincidence of time and place was pretty extraordinary. And so the more we looked into it, the more we found that actually there is pretty good evidence that they must have had an accident in that laboratory sometime in late 2019. And so I feel very strongly that this is a terrible episode for the reputation of science. And I've spent my entire life passionate about science. So it's a very disillusioning moment.
One last, thank you for sharing that. One last question on this. You said accident. You think it was accidental. Was there anything in your research that could have indicated the opposite, that there may have been some intentionality behind this? So obviously there are a lot of people that think that, but I don't know if any evidence emerged in your explorations that may have indicated that to you.
Essentially, no. Everything we looked at told us that they were doing in that lab what they said they were doing, which was preparing for the next pandemic. Now, there's a terrible irony in the fact that it was pandemic prevention research that probably caused a pandemic. If they hadn't done that research, we might not have had that. We almost certainly wouldn't have had that pandemic. So that's shocking enough in itself, without any intentionality. Now, that said, one of the ways they wanted to prepare was to create a pan-coronavirus vaccine eventually, That was where they were headed, but they were a long way off that. They were still in the stage of saying, let's work out which bat viruses are dangerous. And in order to do that, let's soup some of them up and infect human cells with them and train them on human cells, which is a really stupid thing to do. I mean, it's looking for a gas leak with a lighted match, basically. But so stupidity is a much better explanation than
evil.
Yeah. But there was People's Liberation Army involvement in that lab. I think it was defensive, i.e., I think the bio-warfare efforts in China were mostly about getting ahead of terrorism, worrying that the Americans might invent something, more than about trying to develop an offensive weapon themselves. That's certainly the way American and European bio-warfare research is. It's mostly defensive. And I think since the end of the Cold War, that's mostly been true. But you can see how the boundary between defensive and offensive gets blurred here, can't you? So I don't think that they were saying, in a year or two's time, we will have a virus that doesn't kill Chinese people but does kill Westerners, and we are then going to deliberately spread it in New York, and off we go. I don't think that was happening, no. I mean, there may have been one or two people who had that in mind in the long run, but I don't think they were involved in the research itself.
That makes sense. I think we could probably attribute a lot more things to stupidity than evil historically in the human enterprise.
Cock up, not conspiracy.
Yeah, right. Matt, thank you so much. This has been an awesome conversation. Thank you for your work. Keep writing. I mean, you're such a prolific author, and very, very grateful to have access to your mind through your books.
Well, that's very welcome of you to say, because I've had slight writer's block the last few days, but it happens.
It happens. Where, if people want to find out more about you, your work, your latest book, where should they go to find you on the internet?
Well, with the help of Stephen McBride, we've just started something on Substack called the Rational Optimist Society, which is where we're going to post stuff by me and him and a few other people. I'm on Twitter at Matt W. Ridley. The W is important. I'm probably going to post less on my website, but mattridley.co.uk is where you can reach me. I've really enjoyed this conversation, Robert. Thank you so much. You've allowed me to indulge in some of my favorite topics, and it's just been a superb way to spend the afternoon.
Likewise. We will do it again. And like I said, anytime you are on this side of the pond, please let me know. I would love to have you in person.
I would love to do that. Yeah. So I'll take you up on that one day.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Matt.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, click here to find more just like it, and here to find our most recent episode. Also, make sure to like this video to help shine light on the corruption of money. And be sure to subscribe to this channel to stay connected.